In all of Swedish history, there is no figure more polarizing than Charles XII, a king who still, 300 years after his death, is equally beloved and hated. His fierce personality immortalized in books and metal albums, but the man himself is still elusive. Known as Sweden's greatest son and its destroyer, the absolutist king had many names in his reign: the Swedish meteor, the Alexander of the North, and the Madman of Europe. But most would know him today by the title Carolus Rex, Latin for King Charles, under which the band Sabaton introduced the king to the greater public. Despite the modern album that bears his name, Charles XII had long been popular beyond Sweden. The French writer Voltaire, a contemporary of Charles's, would write a history on the complex king, one that would inspire Voltaire's own countryman, Napoleon, to a similar fate and suffer the same downfall. Despite the French's odd obsession with him, Charles cast a long shadow across Europe. Had it not been for one moment upon the fields of Poltava, history would remember King Charles the Invincible of Sweden instead of Tsar Peter the Great of Russia. The title of Alexander of the North is apt for the legend of Charles, whose legend was also built by his predecessors. Though it seems strange today, there was a time when Sweden dominated the north. Charles inherited the lands, arms, and rules of his predecessors. Modern Sweden emerged under Gustavus I, who revolted from Danish rule and was elected king in 1523. Gustavus converted his nation to Lutheranism and set the peninsula in opposition to foreign domination. Continued 50 years later by the Lion of the North, Gustavus II, or as he is better known today, Gustavus Adolphus. Adolphus established Sweden as a power in Europe by modernizing armies, creating strict regulation, and challenging Catholic homogeny in Europe by leading Protestant forces against the Holy Roman Empire. While Charles' direct predecessor was his father, Charles XI, who solidified Sweden's territorial gains, domination of the Baltic Sea, and reformed the armies. He established absolute rule in Sweden, for which he was highly resented, but was never able to make use of. Only after his death, Charles XII ascended to the throne as an absolute monarch. Total rule he would make great use of as king in his warfare against foreign powers. Only 15 at the time of his father's death in 1697, Charles was still too young to ascend to the throne. The Estates General ruled as a regency, but Charles' ways were already ingrained in him. The king had had a close relationship with his family and God, the lessons his father instilled in him guiding him, also keeping a deep dedication towards God which defined his rule. Another few episodes of his adolescence display Charles' ambitions. While apocryphal to some degree, they draw a similarity to Alexander the Great, intentional for such a warrior king. By 7, he could supposedly ride a horse and speak German, rising early in the winter to expose himself to the cold as to harden himself. Then, when examining a map of the Swedish Empire, he stated, "The Lord gave thee to me, and the devil shall not take thee from me." Charles had already begun to build his legend of invincibility and courage. Despite his ambition, the Estates General refused to allow the young Charles to rule. Unfortunately, the peace brought by the regency would be short. With a child upon the throne, Sweden's enemies moved to reclaim lost territory. When Charles witnessed the mustering of troops for war, he was taken by a desire to lead them and an obligation to defend Sweden against unjust wars, declaring no war would end until he vanquished Sweden's enemies. In 1700, the 18-year-old Charles forced the Estates General to relinquish power to him, taking the crown from the bishop at his coronation, crowning himself by his own hand on December 24th. Mustering his armies, he then rode out from Stockholm to answer the call to war. It would take him 15 years to return to Sweden, but he would never return to Stockholm alive. Charles had after all inherited an empire basically at war. The Swedish Empire had taken territory across the Baltic in the past 100 years. Denmark desired to restore rule over Holstein, which was ruled by Charles' cousin. The elected king of Poland, Frédéric Augustus, Elector of Saxony, desired to retake Polish coastal cities and defend German interests. While in the east, areas of Finland, Lithuania, and Estonia were claimed by the rising Russian Empire, with the new Tsar, Peter Alexievich, desired to prove himself and the might of his empire by retaking. Swearing off childish pleasure, Charles, after killing a bear, took to the field. Supported by the English and Dutch navies, Charles sent troops to Holstein. He meanwhile headed for Copenhagen to directly challenge Denmark. Upon reaching the shore, he led troops by leaping into the water under musket fire bearing his saber. His disciplined army of Caroleans crushed the Danes, freeing the Duchy of Holstein from occupation. Charles rode into Copenhagen and forced the Danes to surrender and pay reparations, the entire war taking but 6 weeks. After, Charles turned towards the Russians and the Poles in the east. Under the command of a rebellious Livonian noble, Johann Patkul, Russian armies had begun to ravage Riga and Ingra. The Swedes met the enemy with an army of 8,000 under the call of Gott mit uns, or God with us. Due to a blizzard in Charles' tactics, the Russian force of 80,000 was broken and sent into retreat, after which Tsar Peter refused to face the Swedes directly, fearing Charles' might. Uncontested, Charles marched into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where he was welcomed as a liberator with little resistance, as Poland had fallen into civil war against King Augustus, the clergy supporting the German Augustus, but Polish nobles demanding a new king be elected, to which Charles agreed after meeting with nobles. Charles dethroned Augustus, chased him from Krakow to Saxony, and, after a siege, demanded he cede the throne to him. Charles was offered the throne and suggested he take the mantle defender of the Reformed faith like Adolphus had done, but Charles refused. He told he had become king to conquer kingdoms but give them away to others. Instead, Charles elected Stanislaw Leszczynski to the throne. After attending the king's coronation in disguise, Charles turned east to cement his power over Central and Eastern Europe. Charles' strategy was to penetrate deep into Russia and capture Moscow, but Charles had allowed Peter time to recuperate. The great reformer had learned from his defeat before the Swedes. Peter based his new modernized Russian forces upon the Caroleans, after which he commenced the building of a new Russian capital, St. Petersburg, and a Baltic fleet, retaking territory he had lost after his first defeat by Charles. As such, Peter became regarded as equal parts tyrant and enlightened reformer in Russia. Before embarking, Charles visited the grave of his granduncle Gustavus Adolphus and prayed for the same fame and death. Then captured Patkul, came to terms with the Holy Roman Empire, suppressed insurrection in Poland, then left for Russia. By then, it was claimed Charles' only joy was to see Europe tremble, though, upon his entrance into Russia and demand to meet Peter in Moscow, the Tsar responded only with, "My brother Charles would still pose as Alexander, but I flatter myself he will find me no Darius." Charles would truly find himself Alexander of the North. The truth is, Charles desired to not only bloody Peter's nose, but also destroy Russia. He rejected plans to capture St. Petersburg, which was closer to his location, and instead show his might by conquering a greater target, Moscow, planning to place a pretender on the throne to overthrow Tsar Peter. And Charles was not alone in his ambitions. Before his entrance into Russia in 1707, he had struck a bargain with the Cossack commander Ivan Mazepa. The military ruler of Ukraine, Charles needed Mazepa's support to cross the barren Russian plains. Mazepa needed Charles to overthrow Peter so he could unite the Cossacks under an independent Ukraine. Their partnership was the only way either could succeed. Charles had the forces and Mazepa the knowledge and supplies. Despite early victories in Russia, the fears of Charles' advisors, though, would soon be proven correct. Mazepa's support failed to materialize. The Cossacks would not assist the Swedes beyond Ukraine. They proved stubborn, but even when they did mobilize, their revolt was crushed by the Russian army. Charles and his forces were left isolated in hostile foreign territory. When the Cossacks did join the Swedes, it was in greatly reduced numbers without supplies. Here Peter rectified his earlier failures against the Swedes. Instead of attacking them, he harried the combined force across Ukraine and let the Russian winter wither their forces, forcing Charles and his men to eat moldy bread. But lack of supplies still killed 2,000 men. Yet the Swedish forces were able to repel several devastating Russian attacks, but lack of ammunition made them desperate. In the May of 1709, Charles' remaining force of 20,000 captured the fortress of Poltava. The pursuing battle would be the swan song of the Swedish Empire. By June, the Russians arrived with a force of 80,000, but the Tsar was still hesitant to attack. It would instead be Charles who would challenge fate. Despite his advisors' pleas, Charles ordered all able-bodied troops to ready themselves. Despite being massively outnumbered, Charles ordered his forces to break the siege. Still, the Swedes managed to break the assault, almost forcing the Russians to retreat in a pitched battle, but a confused order caused the collapse of the Swedish line, which the Russians pushed to break the Swedes, taking the advantage. The shattered group was forced to flee to Turkey. Charles at first refused to abandon his captured troops, but an injury in battle caused him to collapse. He was sent along with his injured troops across the river to Turkey. For 4 years, Charles, kept as a hostage, attempted to muster his support for war with Russia, but due to court intrigues in the Ottoman Empire, neither forces nor funds materialized. He did convince the Sultan to declare war upon Russia, 4 times in fact, but only once did an attack ever materialize, and the battle did little to tip the scales in favor of the Swedish king. For all his efforts, Charles had few results in Turkey. He did earn the respect of the Turks, though, who gave him the name Ironhead, perhaps the term that best illustrates Charles' character, but he could not gain any alliances, only a guarantee Russia would remove troops from Poland. By October 1714, Charles left Turkey, chartered return to Sweden, and hoped to restore his empire still at war, except the nation was heavily ravaged by war, and he himself was deeply in debt. The situation had changed drastically. Since his departure, King Augustus had been restored in Poland, Denmark and Prussia had declared war on Sweden, and Russia had cut deeper into the Baltic. Disguised as a German officer, Charles made a 14-day trip through Germany to return to his people. While he was hailed by them, the Estates General resented the return of Charles and his advisors. His rule had lost Sweden territory, bankrupted the nation, and turned all of the north against them. Worst of all was the ascension of Russia as a great power, which Sweden could do little to stop. Charles still refused defeat, though. He rallied troops and hoped to restore Sweden. Charles laid plans to make peace with Russia, craft an alliance by sacrificing territory, then turned towards Western Europe with Russia. Meanwhile, he mustered one last force of 20,000 men to invade Norway and remove Denmark from the current war. In October of 1718, Charles invaded Norway and inflicted a crushing defeat on the Danes, proving he was still capable. After, he planned to enlist pirates to restore his navy, then support rebels in England to remove them from Germany. He was once more readied for battle, but on December 11, 1718, his plans were laid to waste. While inspecting the fortifications of Fredrikstad in Norway, the king was shot and killed, either by a sniper from the battlefield or an assassin from within the fortress. To this day, the sudden death of Charles XII is a mystery. Was it a lucky shot from the battlefield in the night, or a successful assassination attempt by a conspiracy from within, as he was seen equally as both Sweden's savior and its destroyer? Though he was dead, many still claim Charles did prove himself invincible. His troops believed God himself protected the king from bullets. Of all the shots Charles received in battle, none proved fatal, and folklore states the king's boots were full of bullets after battle. The discovery of a small object, by pure chance, may support the theory Charles was murdered. A kolknappen, or a bullet made from Charles' coat button. The legendary king could only be killed by something so close to him. Did an assassin fashion it from a button, fearing Charles was truly invincible? Every great legend must maintain his mysteries. Achilles his heel, and Charles his button. With Charles, so too died the Swedish Empire. Charles' sister, Ulrika Eleonora, ascended to the throne, renounced absolutism, then ceded the throne to her husband, the Grand Grave Frederick I. Sweden would never reclaim her empire, and Russia became the master of Northern and Eastern Europe. Charles' sacrifices and failures had caused an irreversible decline. Sweden made peace with the Tsar and accepted all losses, becoming contained to Scandinavia. Charles' rule seemed to have turned the nation off from war. He had gained great glory, but the destruction he left exhausted the land. For all his rule, Charles was consumed and defined by the Great Northern War. It was neither one he started or finished, but it was his lifetime and left him a complicated reputation. Still, after 300 years, Charles is beloved and hated for his actions. He has inspired fear, confidence, and awe all across the globe. It is no coincidence his death ushered in the Age of Liberty in Sweden, yet great advocates of liberty across Europe, such as Voltaire, have been obsessed with the deep contrasts and conflicts of Charles' character, a great complexity of character that is often forgotten in the shadow of what he wrought. Had he lived, Charles would have likely been the Alexander of the North he was said to be, the Napoleon of his age, as the French emperor made the very same efforts and faced the same downfall as Charles. He, like Napoleon, is one of the very few figures upon which history seemed to turn. He did make Europe tremble, but it was strict rule and religion which drove him and all of Sweden to war.